I've always believed that some silences weigh heavier than any scream. And that morning in the boardroom I understood that certain silences can decide your entire life without you ever opening your mouth. The white lights fell over us like cold, merciless blades, sharpening every face in the room. I stood there holding the presentation remote, pressing it again and again while the screen remained frozen. And right then my father, Don Javier Castillo, spoke with that firm voice that never allowed any reply. "You're suspended, Elena Vargas, until you apologize to your sister." A pen stopped midair. Someone swallowed hard, and my sister Valeria Castillo tilted her head, pretending to look offended. Yet the hidden smile at the corner of her lips said everything. No one asked what had happened. No one wanted to understand. In that room there was only one verdict, and I was already condemned. I didn't argue. I didn't move. I simply said, "All right." If my father had known what that phrase would unleash, he might have stayed silent. Because that word was the first tremor of an earthquake that had been building for years. You see, I grew up in a house where silence was celebrated as if it were peace. Where staying quiet meant being mature. It took me a long time to realize that no, that silence wasn't harmony, it was hierarchy. And Valeria learned it much earlier than I did. As little girls, whenever something didn't go her way, all she had to do was cry a little and everyone would rush to rescue her. I remember perfectly, one school project. We argued over something silly, and before the teacher could even speak, my father was already there defending Valeria, giving her new materials and hugging her as if she had survived a disaster. I was left with the same cheap cardboard and with the message that would follow me my whole life. "You're the reasonable one, Elena." And yes, I ended up believing it. Being the reasonable one became my role even before I knew I had accepted it. Years later, when that acceptance letter for a master's program in Madrid arrived, I thought that finally something would be mine. The envelope was thick and elegant with my name printed perfectly. I opened it with trembling hands, full of excitement. My father glanced at it, nodded as if I had told him the bus schedule had changed, and placed it on top of a pile of bills. He didn't even reach the second page. 10 minutes later, Valeria walked in showing off an engagement ring. And then yes, phone calls, champagne shouts, photos, celebrations. My letter ended up buried under a dirty napkin while no one remembered it existed. That night I understood that in my family one achievement was worth less than a spectacle. And when my mother, the only person who truly saw me, passed away, everything became worse. She was the balance, the one who knew when something hurt me, the one who noticed my sleepless nights, the only one who prevented the scale from always tipping toward Valeria. When she was gone, no one remained to stop the favoritism. In the family business, the story repeated itself, only with higher stakes. My father gave me responsibility for the development department, and I built it from a dark little room full of loose cables into an entire floor with engineers who trusted me. I knew every line of every project without showing off, without asking for applause. Valeria, on the other hand, learned to promise things she didn't understand. Impossible deadlines, fanciful budgets, commitments that made no sense. And my father always backed her. "Valeria knows the clients, Elena. You take care of the rest." And I did it. I always did. I put out fires without saying there was fire. Until the project that broke everything arrived. Valeria promised delivery in 4 weeks when the work required 12. My father signed without consulting me. When I raised my voice for the first time in years, he looked at me with that condescending patience that sent me straight back to childhood, as if I were once again the little girl who had to give in for the good of the family. But this time I didn't give in. Because in that hallway just outside the room, while people stepped away from me as if my presence announced trouble, I understood something that hurt more than any suspension. I had spent my whole life being reasonable for people who never intended to see me. And that day, without saying it out loud, I began to leave. It wasn't an explosion. It was a soft, silent, definitive click. The first click of a door that was about to close forever. The hallway toward my office had always been a neutral, almost boring place, but that day it felt different, as if the air knew what was about to happen. People looked at me sideways, they stepped aside, pretending as if they feared being caught in the middle of a family storm that no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. When I reached my floor, I saw it. A memo stuck next to the elevator, a new project organizational chart, a new chain of command, and there right at the top in bold letters shining like a prize, Valeria Castillo. My name wasn't there. It wasn't a mistake. It was an erasure. You were never here. I felt the silence gathering in my throat. Then my phone vibrated. Messages from my team. "Are you okay? Upstairs they're saying strange things. We're still following your schedule, but everything has changed." I replied with nothing. I placed the phone face down on the desk and let it vibrate in silence. Minutes later, my father called. "Elena, do you understand the image we're giving?" That was the first thing he said. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask what happened. He only worried about the image. Always the image. "Just hold on," he repeated. "Family comes first." Family. How could that word sound so empty? When I hung up, Valeria appeared at the door without knocking, as if the office were hers. "Can you finish this?" she said with that soft voice she always used when she knew she held all the cards. Just apologize. She adjusted a loose thread on her sleeve, looked at her reflection in my dark monitor, and smiled like someone who had already won the game. I had seen that smile my whole life. A smile that said, there will be no consequences. But something in me no longer reacted the same. I didn't answer. I didn't even look at her. I simply grabbed my portfolio, closed my laptop, and stood up. Is that all? She asked. I nodded and pronounced the word she never saw coming. All right. I walked toward the door. The click of the latch closing behind me was so small, so polite. But to me it sounded like the end of an era, like a page finally tearing after holding too much weight. When I returned to the office this time alone, I saw it with different eyes. The glass walls, the diplomas, the prototypes, the glow of the computer towers, everything seemed more foreign than ever, as if it no longer belonged to me. I tied my hair in a ponytail, an automatic gesture that always centered me, and I began. I opened the top drawer, and took out what mattered most, the documents I never let anyone touch. Project scopes, risk assessments, meeting notes, invoices, budgets, printed emails, timelines I had corrected at midnight, with a half-cold cup of coffee. I arranged everything in a perfect line on the table, each folder, each signature, each date, without hurry, without fear, only truth. Then I packed my diplomas in tissue paper. I stored the trophies, the recognitions, the prototypes that proved what I had built for the company, even if no one in my family wanted to see it. The wall was left bare, clean, as if waiting for the next person who would pretend to know how to do my job. The laptop vibrated with messages that kept coming, my team, other departments, people who had seen the meeting and pretended not to. I placed the laptop face down again. The silence was cleaner that way. I opened a new document. Not to claim, not to beg, only to close. I wrote my resignation letter, brief, clear, without added emotion, a clean cut on the paper that for years had held my professional life. But the most important step still remained. I opened the company's shared folder, and began to compile the evidence. It wasn't revenge. It was a mirror. Every false promise Valeria had made, every non-existent resource, every email where I warned of the risks, every impossible date without adjectives, without comments, only facts. 2 hours passed as if they were minutes. When the file was ready, I took a deep breath. I knew sending it would break the facade my family had maintained for years. I knew it would change everything, and still I sent it. To department heads. To affected clients. Subject: project documentation and current status. One single click. One single movement. And the entire building changed its noise. The phone started ringing non-stop. First the company lawyer, then a board member, then another client. I answered none of them. I just kept packing things, a pen, a notebook, the mug my team had given me one winter. The only thing I left was a prototype of a project we had saved by working 2 days straight without sleep. I cleaned it, placed it properly, and left it there as a silent reminder of what we had really done. Then Valeria appeared at the door again, this time with agitated breathing and eyes wide open. What have you done? Her voice echoed against the glass. She looked at the boxes, the empty walls, my completely clean desk. Tell me you didn't send that, Elena. Tell me you didn't. I said nothing. I placed the last folder in my portfolio. You can't leave. Dad won't allow it. You're making a mistake. I almost laughed. I closed my laptop and finally replied. No, I'm correcting one. I walked past her without looking back, and in the hallway, while I heard her trembling breath behind me, I understood something with absolute clarity. For the first time in my life, I was no longer afraid of them getting angry. I arrived at the company the next day before 9. The building that had always been a routine, almost boring space now seemed charged with tense electricity. People whispered behind their coffee cups. Their gazes turned away when I looked up, and someone even held the elevator for me but pretended not to when I entered. The atmosphere was so thick I could almost touch it. In the executive area hallway, my father's assistant Nuria Pons waited for me with a folder pressed tightly against her chest. He wants to see you, she said with a voice that barely came out. And I knew it wasn't an invitation. It was an order in disguise. I said nothing. I walked straight to the boardroom. The door was open as if they had been waiting for me all night. Inside, my father Don Javier Castillo sat at the far end of the table with tense shoulders and red eyes from lack of sleep. Next to him, the company lawyer Alvaro Cruz had his laptop open with trembling fingers over the keyboard. In a corner, a paralegal typed without lifting her eyes. And by the window, my sister Valeria Castillo with arms crossed and a twisted face seemed on the verge of a breakdown. No one spoke until I sat down. My father tried to sound strong. As always, we can fix this. Let's be rational. I set my portfolio on the table. The dry thud cut the air. I've come to formalize my resignation. Alvaro swallowed hard. Valeria blinked, incredulous. My father's jaw tightened so much I thought it would break. You don't have to do this, he said. But I had already decided. I opened my portfolio, took out the resignation letter and slid it toward him as if it were the last piece of a puzzle. A suspension without documented cause activates my severance conditions, I said. Section 12. Alvaro nodded. He had already read it. He knew it was true. He knew they couldn't stop it. My father looked at me as if he were seeing a stranger. And then, as always when she felt cornered, Valeria exploded. This is ridiculous. All you had to do was apologize. I pulled out a second folder and pushed it toward the lawyer. This is the documentation of the recent projects. Valeria opened her mouth to protest, but froze when she saw the first pages. Dates, emails, calculations, budgets, technical warnings, everything she had pretended didn't exist. Alvaro turned the pages one after another and his hands trembled more and more. This is extensive, he murmured, and very serious. Valeria leaned over his shoulder as if she could deny the ink on the paper. You can't send this to the clients. They'll think I already did, I interrupted. A silence so deep fell that I could almost hear my own breathing. To whom? Asked Don Javier with a broken voice. To the board and the project leads. Just status updates. My father sank into his chair as if someone had taken the air from him. Valeria looked at me with a panic I had never seen before. Dad, say something, she pleaded, but he was no longer looking at her. He was looking at the folder, looking at the truth he had ignored for years. You've taken us by surprise, he said almost in a whisper. No. I've only shown you what you didn't want to see. Alvaro intervened with a weak voice. Legally she has acted within her rights. Nothing violates confidentiality. Valeria exploded. You can't leave the company like this. Then I stood up, closed my portfolio, and for the first time I said it without fear. I'm not ruining anything. I've simply stopped absorbing the cost. When I said I already had another job, a hollow laugh escaped Valeria. Who's going to hire you after this? The lawyer answered before I could. Anyone who values competence. Valeria fell silent. And for the first time in my life I didn't feel small. My father took a step toward me as if to stop me, but his hand remained suspended in the air. We can still fix this, he murmured. Don't go. I looked him directly at the same level. I already left. And I walked out without looking back. The elevator doors closed, with a soft hum as if the building were finally exhaling. Outside the air was different, lighter as if all the years I had carried on my shoulders had fallen away the moment I left that room. I arrived home, fed Copper my dog, and while the sound of his little paws filled the silence, I felt something strange. Peace. True peace. I poured myself a glass of water. I didn't check emails. I didn't review conversations. I didn't anticipate consequences. That night, for the first time in years, the silence was not a punishment. It was freedom. The next morning, when I went to my new job, no one compared me to anyone. No one doubted me. They simply shook my hand and said, "Welcome, Elena." And while I looked out at the city from a glass wall, I understood something powerful. Leaving was not a loss. It was an opening, a door I chose to walk through myself. Because silence is not always surrender. Sometimes, it is the place where you decide you will no longer allow what can never come back in. And if you who are listening to this have ever felt that your worth was treated like background noise, remember this. Your life does not need their permission to change. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. See you in the next story.